Welcome inside the Duncan Student Center. I'm Pineda alongside Kieran Cantwell. Football's postponed, but Shamrock Sports is not, and we're bringing that to you next.
You know, Notre Dame, they won it in the year that doesn't count. This doesn't matter at all. Join a conference.
Williams helmet off. He's out. Jafar Armstrong in. Fake to him. Setting up the screen to Armstrong. Here goes the senior from Missouri. Room to run inside the 10. Inside the 5. To the right. Ray lined up in the backfield. Same motion, same setup. This time it's the boot. Bryce in trouble, and he is brought down by Foskey. Now they will go. Yep, bouncing outside. It is Kyron Williams. He will go the distance. Notre Dame touchdown, Kyron Williams.
Well, we all saw that resounding performance over USF last week, the 52-0 rout that a lot of Notre Dame fans were hoping for out of that one with the matchup against Charlie Weiss Jr. with a bit of history in the Notre Dame program. So that one was a little personal there on the coaching staff. But in that game, Kieran, who did you think really stood out for Notre Dame?
Yeah, I'm looking at a guy who made his debut this week. He was out last week in injury. Braden Lenzy, wide receiver. He really brings a vertical threat to our offense, something that we were lacking week one. Really opening up the middle of the field for our tight ends and our running backs to use out of the backfield in the passing game. And, you know, he didn't stuff the stat sheet, only 3 catches, 35 yards. But I think that he made a real big impact on our offense and the explosiveness of our offense.
And the speed is unmatched. The former track star, too, who then quit track to focus on football. But it'll be interesting to see how Tommy Rees decides to use him in this offense with some new looks and maybe some plays designed around Lenzy's speed.
Yeah, I really like Tommy Rees seemed to open up the offense a little more this time. Play conservative in his first real, in his debut and as a real offensive coordinator. And I really like what he did with Lenzy. I like how he used the running backs out of the backfield in the passing game. He was more creative this time, and I hope that he can build off of that and add some more creative plays to the playbook.
And in these first 2 games, you mentioned the run game. We've now seen Kyron Williams and Sibo Flemister, 2 different backs, have great games. What excites you about the run game?
Oh, the run game, coming into the season, a running back competition, and I think that it really has led all 4 of them to improve, and I think that they're kind of feeding off of each other. You see Kyron Williams is more physical out of the backfield, and then Tyree comes in with his speed, flash of speed, also in special teams. Jafar offers a really good veteran presence and pass protection, things like that. So I really like so far what I've seen from the running backs.
Yeah, and we're talking about the run game, and we can't ignore one of the biggest run blockers who made a huge difference against USF, and that's Tommy Tremble, the tight end with the outstanding performance, partially responsible for a good number of those touchdowns that we saw on Saturday, especially the 14-0 one from Chris Tyree with just an incredible block. But what's so exciting about watching him both blocking and what he can do with the ball as well?
Yeah, coming into the season, I was looking at Tremble to kind of take over the role of Cole Kmet in the passing game, and he has done a good job with that. He was our leading receiver this past week against USF. But the strides he's made in run blocking, using him as our lead blocker out of the backfield, I really like that, especially down the goal line. You mentioned the Tyree play where he came and cleared out that cornerback. That was really good. And then also I seen him, come in not even out of the backfield when he's lined up on the offensive line. On Sibo's run, that was a right end run, and he kind of just cleared off the edge there and gave Flemister, a wide open lane to the end zone. So really like what I've seen so far from Tommy Tremble.
Yeah, so does Ian Book. Ian Book said after the game that he's the best run blocker that he's seen play, which is a pretty big compliment considering some of the other guys that have come through the program in recent years. But you mentioned Cole Kmet and kind of like that comparison. Tremble really like stepping into that role, and Tommy Rees using multiple tight ends in different sets. It's an interesting look from him and a new look and kind of changing up. I know you like the new look offense. So what's just the biggest difference that you've noticed from the Tommy Rees offense when you think back to the Chip Long offense?
I think it's opening up the middle of the field, something that Notre Dame hasn't really used in the past few years. Even when Book is looking to his wideouts, it's usually sideline catches. We had Claypool, who's one of the best sideline possession receivers in all of college football last year. But we don't really have those guys this year, so we have to open up the middle of the field more. When you have 2 tight ends as talented as Tremble and Michael Meyer, the freshman 5-star recruit, you have to be able to utilize them. And so I think that Tommy Rees has done a really good job of, tailoring the offense to what he has, not tailoring his guys to his own offense. So very impressed with Tommy Rees, especially the performance against South Florida.
And Michael Mayer has some of those Baby Gronk nickname whispers maybe coming, so also a big compliment there. I don't think it gets much bigger than that when you think about those compliments. But we talk a little bit about Book. So we look at this performance against USF. Obviously a great performance, 3 rushing touchdowns, looks good passing too. How much do we have to take this with a grain of salt, though?
I mean, I really like what I saw with him. When he had a few really good throws on the move. I know Lindsey's first catch was a sideline. It was on the sideline, and Book was rolling out right, hit him with a good pass. And I think he did a good job of going through his secondary reads, something that, we noticed that he didn't really do the first game. And so I'm glad to see that Book, I see that Reese is trusting a little bit more in Book to make those reads, and Book kind of fulfilled Tommy Reese's fate there. But I think that, Book didn't have a great statistical game, but he did what he needed to do, move the chains, average 7.5 yards per attempt. You can't ask for much more than that. And I think that something he did really well was he scrambled when he needed to, but he waited for the field to open up first before. So I think that Book made a good stride week 2. Hopefully he can keep it up. I want to see how he does against more aggressive and more talented pass rushers. But, with all the time in the world, he showed that, he can stay in the pocket and deliver some good throws.
Yeah, and the reads. I mean, that's the huge thing. That was the biggest question mark in the offseason was, can he do that? And can he clean up his game? Because a lot of times when he didn't do that and he kind of forced his first option, that's when you see turnovers and those interceptions. He played a clean game against USF with no interceptions. So definitely a positive marker there. And it is a team that you do take with a grain of salt. But as you head into more of these ACC opponents, it is something that I hope that Book can carry over and get kind of that practice going through his reads, taking his time, and sitting back in his pocket. So definitely a bright spot there.
Yes.
Well, we also wanted to talk about the depth. We saw a lot of different guys play this week, one of which was Jack Kaiser, who got the game ball after, but was the 4th string coming into that week on the scout team, and then found out Saturday morning that he was getting the start and really just stepped into the role. So what did you like from him this weekend? I
mean, very impressive finding out late that he's going to be starting. That's never easy to do, especially at a school like Notre Dame. But, he was flying all over the field, 7 solo tackles, 2 for loss. If he can shore up the linebacker depth, then I think that that's really important. And we did a really good job of stopping the run game. We kind of showed our physicality up front. Our front 7 really dominated this game. And then, Kaiser, great standout there. Hopefully we can see some more improvement as the season goes on.
So we've broken down USF, and now we thought that we would have a game to preview this weekend, but as we know, 7 positive cases on Tuesday led to a change there. That game postponed. USF also postponed their game this weekend so that they could go through contact tracing and see if they would have to worry about any of their guys, and then put them through the proper modes of quarantine and continue testing there. So this will be interesting to see, because it was a big question coming into the college football season of, can COVID be spread on the field, which football is a very physical sport. It probably can. So the nerves then are, if Notre Dame can test negative on Friday, potentially spread it to USF on Saturday, and then test positive Sunday, Monday, what does that say about the future of college football this season? And so it brings up the very extreme question of, would it cancel the college football season, which probably not, but it could change some things. So what do you kind of think of all of this, and what do we make of this postponement?
Well, I think something to note is that this was a non-conference game. It's a very conference-heavy schedule this time, so due to coronavirus. So, the spread of the coronavirus throughout different conferences is what concerns me the most. So hopefully USF will not test positive. But if they do, it's going to be, I'm glad that we canceled this game and postponed it for later instead of, just scrapping it altogether, But if we can contain the coronavirus here, we have 2 weeks off before our next game. If we can contain it here, I think we should be good going forward. I certainly hope so, because, the excitement bringing college football back, if it all just turns out that it's going to get canceled again, that'd really be a heartbreaker.
Yeah. Well, it's a good thing that we're not going by the Coach O mentality at LSU, where he said all of his team already got it, or the Texas Tech mentality, where almost the entire team got it there as well. So Notre Dame definitely trying to keep those numbers down, and we'll see the result of that as USF continues to update their news on any positive case that might surface in their program. But we look at that postponement, now December 12th, the Wake game goes, and you don't like that.
I'm not a big fan of that, because I think that Wake Forest is one of those teams where it's a lose-lose situation. If we beat them, it's not really going to have any impact on us getting into the playoff, especially if it's our last game. We already had our Clemson test, North Carolina. I think that's going to be a test. But I think it's a potential trap game, especially on the road. Wake Forest, they're going to be much more experienced now. So I think that if we lose that game, that could really hurt our playoff chances, especially if we come in with a loss. I think it's over at that point. And even if we beat them, I don't think it has much implication. So I think that could hurt us in the end. But overall, we should beat them. We should take care of business as long as we go in there with the right mindset and take care of everything, it should be all good.
Yeah, and it goes from the last game being Syracuse at home to Wake on the road. And those teams are both at the bottom of the ACC right now, but very different teams at the bottom of the ACC. Syracuse definitely looks to not be quite the potential caliber opponent that we think that Wake might have the potential to be, especially if some of those injuries are cleared up by that December matchup. So definitely kind of a question mark there, but one that Notre Dame now has plenty of time to prepare for. And that also bumps the ACC championship a week back, December 19th. So they had said initially December 12th or December 19th. Well, Virginia Tech postponed to December 12th. So that game already got pushed back to the 19th, and now that's that week later, also because of the Notre Dame postponement. So we'll see those final college football rankings come out December 20th. So it's going to be an interesting couple days when you consider the fact that Notre Dame could face Clemson again on December 19th, potentially, followed by those final college football rankings the day after. So kind of going down the stretch here, and what are you most excited about, and what do you think Notre Dame's chances are to get to that point with that Clemson rematch that then could turn around with potentially, maybe still a spot in the college football playoff?
Yeah, well, I think it's important not to overlook the next few games. We got Florida State. They can always be a problem. They have really good athletes, both sides of the football. So we got to make sure we take care of business there. Then we have Louisville and Pittsburgh, two teams in the middle of the ACC, kind of on the rise, some veteran quarterbacks. But I think we should take care of business there. Clemson, I think this whole season really comes down to how we can perform against Clemson. And even if we can't beat them when they come into our place, as long as we give them a physical fight, and we give them all they can handle, and then we can prove ourselves that we belong in that elite tier of teams. So I think this whole season comes down to our performance against Clemson in our home game, and then hopefully we can see them again in the ACC championship.
Yeah, and that'll be interesting. A season that it looked like had the potential to face Clemson 3 times. Now that other conferences in the Power 5 are playing, that college football playoff landscape is going to look a little bit different, probably less of a likelihood that you would see Notre Dame and Clemson in that. But that brings us to those other conferences that now reversed course this week and went from not playing to deciding, in fact, to play seasons that are very, very short compared to what the ACC is doing. So what do we make of that? And if it comes down to it, does a 7-0 Pac-12 team have any argument to make it into the college football playoff?
It's going to be really hard to decipher that. I think it depends on the eye test this year. When you're looking at the Pac-12, I think Pac-12 this year is I think it's a singular top-heavy conference. I think Oregon is really the only team that can hang with, the SEC powerhouses, with ourselves and Clemson in the ACC, and then Oklahoma out in the Big 12. I want to see how well Oregon can take care of business. It's unfortunate that we weren't going to get any any Pac-12 versus Big 10. Oregon they had a big game against, some powerhouse teams at the start of the season that unfortunately got canceled due to the coronavirus. So I want to see Oregon play well. Hopefully they can get a chance into the playoff. But, I think that this could be the year to try to, flirt with a little expansion of the playoffs. Because, there's been talk about it over the past. I have not really been a big proponent of it because sometimes we'll see the 1 versus 4 games are not even close. But I think this is a good year to try it out and see how much parity there is in college football now. And because we've been seeing a little bit more parity over the past, now it's not Alabama, Clemson every single time. We have some other contenders. So I think this could be a good year to try that out.
On the other side of that, though, if you do try it out this year and you see a Pac-12 upset an SEC team, well, how much can you really do with that? Because in a normal year, if they were playing the same amount of games, you may not have seen that. So then if you come down to it and this Pac-12 team has this amazing performance, but after a shortened 7-game season, what do we make of that? Do we keep the expanded playoff, or do we say, no, this is a kind of a special year? There's just a lot of questions around that. And it is such a weird year, which means, first of all, on the one hand, you could experiment. And on the other hand means you can't really, because if you did experiment, what do you do with that when you see the results of that experiment? Yeah,
that's a good point you bring up. Right now it's hard to take anything from this year and apply it to any other years just because it's so much different now. But I just want to see some flexibility and some fluidity within the College Football Playoff Committee. I want to see a little bit more of them. I want them to take this season just as serious as others, maybe even more serious, to try to see what's best for the sport. I know a lot of people, the Pac-12 especially, been clamoring for a little bit of an expansion because they aren't, usually aren't given a chance. But I think that it could be really fun this year. Maybe, you were mentioning that every single team is bowl eligible now. Every single team, and so now I would say maybe, if there's an undefeated team, why not let them in the playoff and see what they can do against, one of the powerhouses? Give them a chance, maybe teams such as Group of 5, UCF, things like that.
Oh, like the Mountain West, you mean?
Yeah, and such as the Mountain West.
Maybe the University of New Mexico will put on a great show this year. Probably not, but we'll see. But it is interesting, like when you consider all of these different conferences and the different arguments they can make this year, because you look at when the Big Ten and the Pac-12 canceled, and the Big Ten was a much bigger deal just because of the playoff implications. But the Pac-12 does have Oregon, and when you come down the stretch, then if Oregon puts on a great 7-0 shortened season, why should they be left out of the playoff if an SEC team falters and has a couple losses but has more wins in that win column? So it is just going to be an interesting decision of what counts as the most deserving teams to make it in this year when they're playing drastically different seasons but competing for the same couple spots in the college football playoff. So you might have a decent idea there where you're thinking about expanding it, and we'll see if that's something that would be considered. It probably won't be, but I feel like we're back in the shoes of Austin Rooney and John Horlander and Johnny Soper. They had this argument so many times, so running back through that a couple years later. But it is crazy when you think about the season as a whole, because when you compare the ACC, that Clemson game we circled so early on, and it seemed so late in the season to think about a November game against Clemson. It's cold, like it's towards the end of the season. Can we make it there undefeated so that when we play Clemson, it's like the two undefeateds playing? That's when the Pac-12 is starting their season. Like, how crazy is that, Kieran? The Pac-12 will be starting their season on a day that we had circled as, like, nearing the end of ours. I mean, doesn't that say something about just 2020 and college football as a whole?
Yeah, just looking at the rankings every week now, you see there's so many SEC, ACC teams. We're going to see a little bit more implementation of the Big Ten and the Pac-12 as they start playing games. But yeah, we'll already know basically how our season's going to pan out before we have any idea how Oregon looks, USC looks, teams like that. It's going to be really interesting to watch. And then, maybe since our season's so much longer and we're playing, Clemson earlier compared to the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, so maybe they are going to get better chances to prep for the bowl season, and they're going to get bigger tests later on, so they'll be more ready. Maybe we'll have a little more lackadaisical since it's been more time. It'll be all interesting to see once December and January come.
Yeah. So many questions around that, and just the calendar has just shifted so many times already. But when we think back to the Big Ten and that initial decision that they made to postpone the season, do you still think it was the right one in light of them reversing course and deciding to bring it back?
Yeah, so, obviously now in hindsight, I think it's going to hurt them since, they aren't starting as early, much less games. Pac-12 only has, I believe, 6 regular season games and then the conference championship, and the Big Ten has 1 more. But, before we knew how this was going to shake out, I did support the decision, to hold back and, try to consider the players' safety first. I know a lot of players were clamoring to play, trying to, petition to the Governor of California to try to play. But I do agree with the decision back then. I'm glad that they took a look at it, see how the ACC and the Big 12 was starting. SEC as well, they're just getting into action now. But I'm glad they took the time and they, adjusted and made the decision to have the games.
Yeah, and the SEC was always going to be an interesting one to watch just because a lot of those college towns were having big COVID outbreaks, like as all of these decisions were being made. And so like Auburn and Alabama are immersed in these small towns that are really struggling with that. And so football comes into play then, and everyone wants to play football, but how do you play football when your entire town is having such a bad outbreak? And so their slight delay obviously factored in there too, and now they'll start this weekend. But in the meantime, 6 teams in the top 10 from the SEC, and they haven't even kicked off yet. Is that fair? I mean, when we look at rankings, when we look at these teams down the stretch, should Oregon be able to be in the AP poll when they don't play until November in the meantime? Because that's the direction that they decided to go. But, is that fair to the teams that are playing now?
I think that you should include them based on preseason outlooks and predictions and things like that, just in order to keep them, I want them to stay stable throughout the entire season. I don't want it right when Oregon plays their first game to jump from unranked to 6th in the country just because they won by 40. I want to see them there, prove that they belong there. If not, move them down a little. But you mentioned the 6 teams in the SEC. It seems like this argument happens every year. Does the SEC really deserve this? And honestly, I don't know yet because we haven't seen them. But I do really like some of the SEC. I like all of the SEC teams this year, not just the top-heavy Alabama, LSU, Georgia type teams. Usually they'll face each other in championship. I'm looking more at Florida, at Texas A&M, and at Auburn, who they all have some certainty, much more certainty at quarterback than the other 3 teams I mentioned. You got some veterans in Kyle Trask, Bo Nix, and Kellen Mond. I really want to see how they can do against those SEC powerhouse defenses.
Well, don't count out LSU quarterback Miles Brennan this year. I think that he actually has the potential to fill Joe Burrow's shoes in a pretty significant way. I mean, he trained. That's the thing with Alabama, Georgia, and LSU is you look at these quarterbacks that are now stepping into those roles, and yeah, they don't have the experience, but think about who they trained under. Like, think about advice you can get from Tua. Like, think about Tua mentoring you. So you know, in certain situations like that, Mac Jones now will be coming in for Alabama. He played the 4 games when Tua was hurt, but that's it. And you have Miles Brennan at LSU, who played behind Joe Burrow for 2 years after losing the quarterback competition to him. And so you see these guys, JT Daniels at Georgia, who is still questionable to play with a knee procedure that he had a couple months ago. But you know, you look at all of these guys coming in, and it's like, well, what will they do when they take the field? Because they've had this mentorship. They're in these programs that know how to breed good quarterbacks. So when you see them now, in comparison to some of these guys that are coming in, like Bo Nix at Auburn has shown great promise. What's going to happen? I mean, it'll be interesting to see from the SEC, but really just a strong conference for quarterbacks.
Yeah, you mentioned Mac Jones playing the last 4 games after Tua's injury, and he did really well in the bowl game as well. So I think that Mac Jones has kind of proven himself so far to be in command of that offense. You really like Miles Brennan. I can see that happening. You know, Joe Burrow is probably one of the toughest shoes to fill in recent memory, you know, bringing LSU back, having the record-setting season, the Heisman-winning season that he had. So he's definitely going to have a big challenge ahead of him. And then you mentioned JT Daniels, just a brutal ACL injury week 1 last year. You know, one of the most promising recruits out of high school. He actually enrolled early, was very excited to play at USC, and it just didn't work out for him. So I want to see him at Georgia. I hope he does well. You know, with Jamie Newman opting out, he has a chance now to take the starting job. So I'm very excited to see how JT Daniels does. But yeah, a very deep quarterback conference there in the SEC.
Yeah. You refer to my hot take, and it is a hot take that Miles Brennan can fill Joe Burrow's shoes, but that's my hot take of the day. I do think that we will see good production from Miles Brennan. I think he will fill that role, but we'll see. I mean, it'll be interesting to see, and there's a lot of factors that go into it, especially considering that some of those guys at LSU have opted out. Jamar Chase was one of the first big names to really opt out of the season, and so it does change the landscape when you're missing some of those guys that you're counting on in the preseason and you're practicing, and when spring practice is canceled and you're looking ahead, and then some of the guys that you thought you were going to be able to count on opt out of the season, it changes the landscape. So that'll be a chance, too, for some of those teams in the SEC who aren't normally in contention for the conference championship to show that they belong in the SEC in a very unconventional year in so many ways. But as we look at college football as a whole and we look at all of these conferences, one thing that I'm very interested to see is when we get closer and closer to the playoff, how the playoff committee rephrases, if they have to rephrase, what they use as criteria to get in. And so we talked about kind of the idea of expanding it, but assuming that they don't, their normal criteria is the most deserving teams. And so when we look at the most deserving teams and you look at these guys and you see the SEC, which is such strong quarterbacks, how much do you think they're just kind of go off the AP poll this year, maybe more than normal? Do you think the college football playoff team is going to rely more on the AP poll than they do in a normal year and kind of just go off of what it seems like the general consensus is there?
I definitely do think they will do that. The reason being there's no inter-conference games this year. You're not going to have any. The only similar games you're going to have are teams that are in the same conference. You're not going to have any. You know, some years you'll have one of the better Big 12 teams play one of the Pac-12 teams, and then you can see how they did against them, how Pac-12 did against SEC, things like that. You're not going to have any type of comparison this year, so it's going to be very difficult to rank the teams. And honestly, I would not be surprised if they just put in, if the SEC looks really good, if they look like they're playing the best brand of football throughout the entire year, and there's looking like 3 very deserving teams from the SEC, I would not be surprised if a team that doesn't even play in the SEC championship makes the college football playoff, just based on the eye test and just the unforeseen circumstances this year.
And the reason I brought us back to the AP poll is because as we look at Notre Dame in it, that'll be interesting to see. I mean, with Notre Dame trying to make the playoff, it's going to be hard now to make a case. It was going to be so much easier when it would have been without the Big Ten and the Pac-12, obviously, for Notre Dame to make that case if Notre Dame and Clemson could both play in the playoff, which would mean potentially playing 3 times in one season, which would just be unheard of normally. But now as we look at that, Notre Dame standing in the AP poll matters a lot because as it comes down the stretch there, if the college football playoff does kind of rely more on that when making those final rankings on December 20th, Notre Dame's stance in the AP poll matters a lot.
Yeah, and I think that something that matters a lot more now is how much do you beat inferior opponents. You know, the first week we beat Duke 14, it looked a little bit shaky. I feel like we should have won by a little bit more. But the 52-0 beat down on USF really helps our case because those are going to be the games that they have to look at. They're not going to be able to look at more primetime games just because, the ACC, there's only 2 really perennial contenders in us and Clemson, So I think that those games are much more important now. And then, it's going to be tough for them to be for the College Football Playoff Committee. This is definitely the biggest test they're going to face so far.
And we'll see what happens against FSU, the next chance to blow out an opponent. But thank you for watching Shamrock Sports.